It's all about experience, experience, experience. It's time for experience. It's about experience, experience. Prepare yourself for experience. Lead devotees to victory with authentic connectivity. Build your brand on the wings of an eagle. Watch your fandom soar. With mind-blowing experience, you're making your customers delirious. If they try to tune you out, you'll innovate like never before. Experience, experience, experience.
So the Picasso story, and why you're going to be famous through this podcast,
Okay.
is he was walking down the street. I'm assuming this is a fake story. It's like one of those Garrett Gravison, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. But he was walking down the street, and a woman comes up to him with a piece of paper and asks him to draw something on the paper. And essentially, he draws something, takes the time to do it, gives it to her. She asks, how much can I pay you? He says, you can't afford how much this would cost if I were to actually charge you what it's worth. And she was like, what do you mean? Like, it only took you 30 seconds. And he goes, no, it took me 50 years. And as the idea, so this podcast is going to be like your rookie moment, but like 37 years in the making.
Yeah.
So here we go.
Cool.
Excited to have a fun conversation about your 37 years, David, at Chick-fil-A, helping lead marketing. And I think with Chick-fil-A, a lot of people want what Chick-fil-A has today without understanding fully what it took to get there. And the fact that Chick-fil-A 10, 20, 30 years ago wasn't what it is now.
Yeah.
Like, there's been a process. It wasn't an overnight success story, similar to Picasso maybe.
We used to joke about it. It was the overnight success story, 40 years in the making.
This is it.
know.
And people look at Chick-fil-A now and want to emulate what they do. I think about it. I was telling you the story earlier. When I played minor league baseball, I would do pitching lessons in the off season because I made less than zero money. And so I had to make rent. And I'd do these lessons with these little kids, and they'd come in and it would be a hitting lesson, and they wanted to have the big leg kick of Ronald Acuna. And it was tough to get them to see the vision of like, no, we need to focus on fundamentals. There's some mechanics that need to be in place that allows Ronald Acuna, who's 25 years older than you, to be able to do what he does at a really high level. And I think the comparison for me is people look at Chick-fil-A and want to imitate what they do today. They'd be better off thinking about what was Chick-fil-A doing 10, 20, 30 years ago to be successful. So want to go to the very beginning, because Chick-fil-A preceded you joining, but you were still there early days.
Yes.
Like how did you end up at Chick-fil-A? What did that look like joining the Chick-fil-A family?
Yeah. Well, Aaron, you'll be glad to know that at age 21, like most 21-year-olds, I had all of life figured out. And,
Like we all do.
Like we all do. And here's how I had it figured out. I felt like I was going to graduate from college, make as much money as I could, as fast as I could, to retire as early as I could. And I'd set 35 as my goal. And I said, if I can just be retired by age 35, how could life get any better than that? That's the best I had as a 21-year-old kid. And unfortunately, I find it's the best a lot of other 21-year-olds have. It's the best a lot of 31-year-olds have, 41-year-olds, 51, 61-year-olds. I think a lot of people think their whole career is about retiring.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the goal. So instead of that, I ended up meeting a guy my junior year in college named Truett Cathy, who was the founder of Chick-fil-A, and got recruited out of college. In fact, I started 4 hours after college graduation at Chick-fil-A, and it ended up that I tell people, instead of finding the job I could retire from early, I found something 1,000 times better. Something that at age 21 had never crossed my mind. In fact, something I'm not sure I would have believed. If someone told me what I'm about to tell you at age 21, I don't know if I'd believe it. I wouldn't believe it had I not seen it play out in Truett's life and lived out in my own life. Instead of finding the job I could retire from early, I found the job I wouldn't want to retire from. See, I had just assumed, based on what I'd grown up, that the whole point of work was to stop doing it. I'd never considered that work in and of itself could be a source of joy, satisfaction, contentment, excitement, enrichment. You know, it could be thank God it's Monday instead of thank God it's Friday. I never considered that. And I think a lot of people haven't considered that. Work is a job, a job, and a paycheck.
It's a means to an end.
It's a means to an end.
Yes.
I had never considered it could actually be a means to a great life in the absence of the paycheck. And so what Truett taught me is he used to say, if you love what you do, you'll never work another day in your life. So
Some wisdom there.
I worked under a guy who never worked a day in his life. For 37 years, I never worked, and I got paid anyway. And it's such a great gig. And the other thing that he, really helped me see clearly is the whole reason I wanted to make a lot of money to retire early is I just assumed that the riches in life were all found in a bank account. I never considered that the real riches in life will never exist in a bank account. They're in the richness of relationships. They're in the richness of experiences. They're in the richness of the mission we're on. They're in the richness of community that we feel. In fact, if you made enough money to retire early, you're looking for all those riches, and you exchange, the monetary riches for those riches. Well, you can find those riches anyway, and so, I spent 37 years at Chick-fil-A enjoying the riches that are never found in a bank account, and realizing that the job in and of itself could be what I thought early retirement was going to be. And so it was a fascinating experience to go through. But to your point, it didn't start that way. I feel like we got to almost take a picture. I didn't start, Chick-fil-A was not a startup, but it was close. We were in
scrappy.
It was a scrap. Well, we were in a converted air freight warehouse, just a handful of people, literally tin roof, 10 walls, and they had run out of room in the warehouse that we were in. This was a converted air freight warehouse that was near the old Atlanta airport. So they run out of room in the warehouse when I got there, so they cut a hole through the wall, pulled up a mobile home, and my first office was in a mobile home attached to an air freight warehouse. And they had hired a guy named Steve Robinson in January of my senior year. I graduated in June. So 6 months ahead of me, they hired to start a marketing department. And then I was the first.
He was the first hire.
He was the first hire in the
6
marketing
months
department.
later.
6 months later, I started. I was the
number
second.
2.
And it was a fascinating journey to be on. And, it's funny. Truett, Kathy grew up in poverty. And he grew up in a place called Techwood Homes that's in downtown Atlanta near Georgia Tech campus. And it was the very first federal housing project in the United States. That's where he grew up. And so extremely poor. His dad had been a farmer down in South Georgia, and the boll weevils came through, so he started selling insurance, but he was never very successful, never home much. His mom actually took their government housing project and took on boarders, became a boarding house, and that's where he learned some of his cooking skills because he'd have to help his mom with that.
I didn't know this. Okay, this is new for me.
Yeah. And so anyway, but it was funny because when Truett talked about his childhood, it was extreme poverty. You know how he talked about his childhood? He called it the gift of poverty.
It's the power of perspective.
The power of perspective. Because he said, I learned all these things that would be important to me that I may never have learned in the absence of that gift of poverty season. And so I think about my time at Chick-fil-A, and I almost feel like I lived through a chapter of Chick-fil-A was the gift of poverty.
Yeah.
Because at the time I joined Chick-fil-A, 40% of our locations at any point in time were unprofitable. I mean, I don't think there's a Chick-fil-A in the world that's unprofitable today, but 40% were unprofitable.
That would be shocking for most people to contemplate.
Yeah. And so, on the one hand, that wasn't good. On the other hand, I call that job security because the reason they hired me was to go out and work with the individual operators that were unprofitable and help them grow their sales.
So that was one of your initial focus.
That was the initial focus was literally why they hired me was to go work with individual restaurant locations. And at that time, we were 100% in shopping malls. So every Chick-fil-A location,
not freestanding,
no freestander had been
malls,
ever built.
And you're not doing sexy brand campaigns.
No, we are in a mall,
like a growth partner,
and we are scrappy,
linking arms with owner operators.
Exactly, and figuring out kind of grassroots ways to grow our sales, and very scrappy ways. We didn't have big budgets. In fact, Truett, the second year I was there, went an entire year and didn't take a check. Didn't get any salary because we couldn't afford it. That was the Chick-fil-A
that you knew that most people don't know today.
But I look back on it and I say, man, what a gift that was to have lived through that chapter and see what it took to grow out of that chapter. Here's another interesting fact that may make this whole thing more relatable than the Chick-fil-A of today. For my first 10 years at Chick-fil-A, 100% of the people I hired took a cut and pay to come. So for your listeners out there, what would your life be like if you had to hire a bunch of people and every single one had to take a cut and pay? What would you offer them? Well, that's what gave me a crystal clear view, like a technicolor view of the real riches in life, because I didn't have financial riches to offer people. So I had to offer them something different. And we offered them, the richness of experiences, the richness of relationships, the richness of the mission we were on, the richness of the community, the richness of the future we were building, and that they could be part of it and being part of a really rich story. And so we had to focus on those things initially, but we became very grounded in what those things were. And those were what produced all the riches that people see, the financial riches. Now, the riches now were the fruit, not the object of what we were doing.
So Paul Graham, the venture capitalist, talks about this principle of anti-scale. And it's this, I'm going to say it less eloquently, but the principle is most people, there's an obsession in business with scale, in designing for scale. And he would suggest that when you design for scale, what happens is that you design for the average person, and nobody's the average person. So what happens is that you design experiences, products, solutions, messaging that are pretty mediocre because we're aiming for the average person, lukewarm coffee, if you will.
Yep.
And like one of the examples he uses is Brian Chesky at Airbnb. Early days, they were having trouble getting hosts onto the platform. And so their leadership team, the founding team, would go around and they would show up, Brian Chesky, founder, CEO, would show up to an Airbnb with a camera and take pictures of the rental and post them for the host online to make their rental look better, to drive more signups, knowing that if more signups happened for the rental, they would engage more, be more committed. All of a sudden the platform would grow. And it's a ridiculous thing. Like no business consultant would come in and say, hey, founding team or leadership team, you need to go and have executives take pictures themselves and upload those pictures themselves to the Airbnb site. So there's this principle, but by doing that, they created something that people loved, not just liked. And I think Chick-fil-A, early days that you're talking about, y'all had to be scrappy and resourceful. And you thought about how do we create a product, a chicken sandwich, and an experience wrapped around that chicken sandwich that people love. Talk about you're in the mall with owner operators, 40% are not profitable, but there's this vision that like, hey, we have something here. What were some of like the anti-scale moments that you experienced?
Well, probably the best one that I could share with you occurred in the early 90s. And in the early 90s, there was a company that was originally called Boston Chicken. There were I think they had 13 locations up in the Northeast. And then suddenly, a venture capital firm bought them, and a bunch of money came their way. And then they did an IPO and went public. And all of a sudden, they were the darling of Wall Street. I mean, they weren't on just the cover of every restaurant magazine. They were on the cover of every business magazine, Fortune and, Business Week and all this stuff. And, they were the hot new thing. To compare it today, they would be, the Apple or the Microsoft or whatever, So we were getting nervous because all of a sudden this little small chain of 13 locations almost overnight was as big as we were. And this was the early 90s. And they set a goal of being $1 billion business by the year 2000. And we're like, wow, we better get with it. Because they were a legit competitor too. They had high quality food. They now had lots of money. They were growing fast.
They're doing things right.
Doing things well. But scale was on their mind. And so Dan Cathy, the son of Truett Cathy, decided we needed to somehow keep up with them. And so he went on a little trip to New York because he wanted to explore what would it look like for us to grow bigger faster, because that's what they were doing.
Grow bigger faster. Okay.
Yeah, grow bigger faster.
That was the brief for the team. Okay.
Yeah, and so he went and we explored, loans from banks. We explored going public, venture capital, all those things. And he came back to report on his trip to New York to the executive team. And Dan was kind of sitting at one end. And Dan is a very articulate guy. He's an emotional guy. He's a cheerleader. He's a visionary. And man, he is rallying the troops at one end. And, he's fire and brimstone talk about how we're going to get bigger faster. And Truett's at the other end of the table. And I'm sitting down by Truett and I'm noticing Truett is not liking what he's hearing. And so at one moment, very uncharacteristic for Truett, he beat his fist on the table. He's sitting at the other end from Dan, beats his fist. He says, ladies and gentlemen, I am sick and tired of hearing you talk about getting bigger. He said, we need to get better, because if we get better, customers will demand we get bigger. So as you might imagine, the whole tone changed. And all of a sudden we went from how are we going to get bigger faster to how are we going to get better. So now here's the interesting part of this story. And this was literally a time that marked my entire business career. And I want to tell you why. In the year 2000, when Boston Market had wanted to be $1 billion business, you know what was happening with Boston Market? Something else that begins with a B. Bankruptcy.
Yep.
Bankruptcy in the year 2000.
The shoe was going to fall. Yes.
You know what happened at Chick-fil-A in the year 2000?
Guessing
$1 billion
$1
business for the first time. But our paths were so different. And so I want to unpack it just a little bit to speak to the issue of scale. Because every company I know wants to get bigger faster. It's like that becomes the goal. And they had so much money they could throw at it that they could. So let me give you an example of how this played out and why Chick-fil-A became $1 billion business and they ended up in bank. So they would go to a place, let's say Dallas. And because they had all this money, they would declare, we're going to open 60 locations in Dallas in the next 2 years. And they had the money to do it. And when you make that day, you got all the real estate agents. They would love to help you find 60. Yes, clamoring.
You have a lot of friends at that point.
Yeah.
Yep.
But anybody who's spent any time in real estate knows if you need 60 A++ locations, you're not going to find 60 in 2 years. So they would get the A+ locations, but then they'd quickly go to A-, B-, C-, and D locations. And 2 years later, they opened their 60 locations, but a lot of them are C's, D's, and F locations. So they had a compromise. So they declare victory, and everybody thinks, what an amazing company, what a successful company. They just opened 60 locations. But they compromised on a lot of the. Secondly, now we got to staff all those locations. So they may have started with a few A players, but now they end up with B, C, D, and F players. So now you've got this portfolio of 60 locations, but half of them are not very good locations, and a lot of them are being run by poor people, and then the whole thing kind of implodes on itself, and a few years later, bankruptcy. Contrast that with Chick-fil-A.
It feels so clear now. But
yes. Yeah. But Chick-fil-A, we were focused on getting, and the other thing is, one of the things I learned during that season is bigger works against getting better. Can you imagine trying to open 60 locations, the amount of work involved with finding locations, building the locations, staffing locations, training, can you imagine all that effort? Is that going to make you better, or is it going to challenge you? So what Chick-fil-A did instead is we focused on getting bigger by getting better and let customers demand. So instead of opening 60 locations in one market, we would wait, and we had our real estate people out all across the country, and we wouldn't do a deal until we had an A+ location with an A+ operator to run it. And it's like at any point in time, we might be looking for 200. We have 200 locations on a radar to only do 50. And the way we would pull the trigger is wherever we could find an A+ location with an A+ operator to run it, that's where we pulled the trigger. So now we're getting better because we got better locations, better people, better product, better service, etc. And it enabled us to grow. Here's the other lesson I learned from that is I was taught in business school that, you've got to appease and please the stockholders because they're the ones that invest in your business. Totally bought into that. Makes sense.
And rich shareholders.
That's why we have the stock market.
Yep.
What I'd not considered is ultimately, if customers are not throwing more money at your business than investors, you'll be out of business. So ultimately, it's really customers that fund our business. It's always customers that fund the business. And they got to be throwing more money at your business than you are. And so we let customers literally fund our business. Chick-fil-A, debt-free. So when we're opening all those new locations, the people that enabled us to do it are customers who demanded more of what we were doing and therefore voted. We used to say every day is an election, here, I'll pull this out because literally what we would do is Dan and Truett used to say every day is an election. And these are the ballots. We wanted people voting for us. And so customers would vote for us often enough that would enable us to open more locations. And we'd only open as many locations as customers voted on us. So it was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And therefore, the focus was on the customers, not the shareholders. Mm-hmm. And that enables you to get better too. Because a lot of times what shareholders want is short-term returns. And a lot of times short-term returns require you to cut corners and do things that may work well in the short run, but it backfire on you in the long run.
I think about early days of Chick-fil-A, like themes you pull out are like there's a contrarian point of view.
Yes.
It's better, not bigger.
Yes.
It's closed on Sunday. Like there are things, there was a willingness to do things that maybe felt risky.
Yes.
It looks like a no-duh decision now,
yes,
but it felt risky at the time. It seems like there was a discipline and a focus on the right things, both on developing a culture that could grow and stay healthy and thrive, but also a discipline to keep focusing on the customer and not get distracted. And there's also enough long-term foresight to make better decisions in the short term. And I think you look at a lot of businesses that feel an existential angst of, hey, like we're not performing this year, we're going to not exist in 5 years from now. Or like, how did y'all navigate? Because the Chick-fil-A, like we talked about, of today is much different than the Chick-fil-A of yesterday. I'm sure there was some of that angst that existed of like, hey, 40% of operators are not profitable yet. We need resources to help keep the lights on here.
Right.
Like, how did you maintain the discipline and the willingness to stay contrarian and take risks and to keep that long-term point of view?
Yeah.
Even when the day-to-day maybe felt hyper urgent.
Well, there was a little model. I wish I had a piece of paper here so I could illustrate it, but I'll try and talk you through it, called the payoff matrix. And it goes like this. If there was like a box with 4 squares, in this portion of the box, we could say, sometimes in life, there are things that have a short-term benefit, but they come with a long-term consequence at no extra expense. So I used to think in marketing, buy one, get one free. Yep. You buy the short-term benefit, you get the long-term consequence. So for example, a simple example would be this morning, the alarm goes off. You know, for somebody who wants to work out every day at 6 o'clock in the morning, the alarm goes off. Now you have a choice. You could take the short-term benefit of staying in that nice, cozy bed, you know, and go back to sleep.
Feels nice.
It feels really nice. Or you could take the, you know, here's the problem. If every day you just kept staying in the bed and you never worked out, I think we all know what the long-term consequences would be.
It's been my life the last couple of weeks.
You would have, you know, there are health problems. You won't see it one day after one day. It's cumulative effect over time. But if every day you're not getting up and you're going back to sleep, then all of a sudden you'll have health consequences, energy consequences, all kind of things down the road, but you don't see them immediately. By contrast, sometimes we can accept what we call the short-term consequence. Get up and go work out. Doesn't feel good maybe at the moment for a lot of people, but if you do that day after day after day, you get the long-term benefit at no extra expense. You know, buy one, get one free. Take that short-term consequence. Well, we live in a society, you know, that loves short-term benefits. You know,
it's a dopamine hit.
It's the immediate benefit that people are looking for.
Yes.
And for a lot of businesses, it's the 90-day quarterly report is their short-term benefit they're looking for. But Truett was always one that would accept the short-term consequence that enabled the long-term benefit. And what I love about it, if I could illustrate this for you, I'd say, you know, short-term consequence, STC.
STC, short-term consequence.
Well, that was Truett's initials.
He
He was always willing to take the short-term consequence that enabled the LTB, the long-term benefit, where most people wanted the short-term benefit, STB, and didn't even connect the long-term consequence. And so I think Truett was very clear because he lived a life of always focusing on the, and here's the other reality. If you just think about investing in general, you know, if you had $100,000 to invest, and I told you in 90 days, I want you back in my office and a guaranteed return. You got 90 days, $100,000, got to have a guaranteed return. What would you consider putting it into if you had to have a return in 90 days?
Guaranteed some type of savings account with
a CD, a savings account, something like
risk
that.
averse, but
which
small.
In the short run, you'll get your guaranteed return. But what do you also guarantee yourself?
You're not going to get the upside of.
It's the worst return
yes.
over the long haul, you know. So The best returns historically over the long haul, if you had a longer time frame, let's say I gave you 10 years to get a return, where would you put that same money?
Feels like some optionality. Now we're talking some growth stocks, some tech investment.
You got all kind of options now. And in general, like let's just say you put it in the stock market. On average, your return is going to be 3 or 4 times what it would be in the savings account so the problem is when we're always focused on short-term benefits, we have the worst options to invest in. But if we think in terms of a 10-year horizon, it opens up the window to all kind of things that don't necessarily pay off in 90 days, but are the best investments over. So it's so funny. I used to go to conferences, and we would have had a great quarter. And people would come up to me at the conference, and they'd say, "What'd you guys do, last quarter to get that great return?" I say, "It's not what we did last quarter. It's what we've been doing for the last 10 years." And so it was the wrong question. They wanted to know what we had done
Changing
in the last.
question.
Yeah, they wanted to know what we'd done in the last 90 days. Well, it wasn't what we'd done in the last 90 days. It's what we'd been doing. And so to enable those great returns, it started a lot further back than what they were looking at.
And then the flip side of the coin. So if that's like the customer experience, it's enabled by a strong organizational culture.
Yes.
Which means that you need talented people who are purpose aligned, values aligned. Culture has been something that you've given a lot of credit to for the success of Chick-fil-A.
Yes.
I was thinking about the rigor by which you thought about the quality of real estate. I've heard you talk about the bozo explosion and maybe that same level of rigor to understanding who's coming in through the doors of Chick-fil-A versus who's not.
Yep.
Oh, this is, I think it's an Apple. Is it a Guy Kawasaki story?
Yes. So, so many things related to this, but Guy Kawasaki wrote an article that day or two after Steve Jobs died, and Guy Kawasaki worked for Steve Jobs, and I think there were like 13 things. And when I read his article, it was like every one of those 13 things I resonate with. In fact, I even put it on my wall at Chick-fil-A because it's like all these are things I've seen play out at Chick-fil-A, but I think it was number 7 on the list was one, and I need an umbrella of grace here, Aaron, because I don't
umbrella
don't mean to be
for both of us. Maybe.
Yes, I don't want to come across judgmental, but he said this. He said a 10 wants to be surrounded by their 10s. We've heard the expression iron sharpens iron. Well, a 10 is invigorated by being surrounded by other 10s because they want to win and they feel like being around those people. I become like those people and it makes me better, and I'm not intimidated by being around another 10. I'm attracted to being around 10s. So he said a 10 wants to be surrounded by 10s, will hire a 10. But 7s and 8s, maybe 5, 6, 7s, 5, 6, 7s want to be surrounded by 3s and 4s because they want to feel superior. And 3s and 4s want to be surrounded by 1s and 2s because they want to feel superior to those. So he said the minute you start lowering your standards from 9 and 10s to 7s and 8s, the bozo explosion has begun because those next level down are going to all hire people weaker than them so they can feel better, feel superior. And that the mentality is very different at that level. And so that, I think, really, we set the bar high. It always amazed me when I would run into people from other businesses, and this is that better verse, would say, we got a job to fill by August the 1st.
It's the short-term consequence. They're feeling the pain of the seat not being filled in the short term.
They'd like set this date when they were going to fill the role, and I'm like, how could you do that? That'd be like saying, if you were single, I'm going to get married by August the 1st.
Yep.
Whoever I happen to meet between now and then expect that it's going to last a lifetime.
Yeah. How honored would the person being pursued feel? Like, I just need to marry somebody.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of businesses are in the business of dating people instead of getting married to people, because you would never come tell me I'm going to be married by August the 1st. If we were sitting here, like we are in February, say by August 1st, I'm going to marry somebody. I mean, it could happen, but the likelihood of it being a successful marriage, if that's the way you did it, is just setting a deadline sometime this year that you're going to get married to whoever happens. I think it's the same thing in business. If you have a long-term perspective on people, you'll wait till you get the right person. Here's the other thing. If you get the wrong person, how quickly, then 6 months later, you just have to go back through it, and then 6 months later. And so people start to create this, revolving door of people instead of waiting till you find the right one. Because Chick-fil-A had a 97% retention rate. Stunning, given the industry. Fast food is an industry known for turnover. We had a 97% retention rate at the support center and for our operators. You know, in the industry, the person running the location, what most other people would have as a manager of a location, it's about a 200% turnover a year. So about every 6 months, they're turning over the manager of a fast food place. By contrast, we have a 97% retention rate. A lot of our operators have been in the same location 20, 30 years. And they're competing with the revolving door next to them. But again, I probably ought to go into one other thing that was really important because we're talking about people and culture. You know, going back to the very beginning of Chick-fil-A, literally the very beginning, Truett started Chick-fil-A in the 60s, 1967. During that time, a lot of fast food chains were being started. That's roughly the time that Wendy's and McDonald's and KFC and, you know, all these different fast food chains, Burger King, all that grew. But the difference, you were talking about different mindset. What really all the other fast food chains looked for was OPM, other people's money. So when they were looking for their next franchisee, it started with the question, does this person have access to, in today's terms, $3 or $4 million worth of capital? Because they got to go buy the land, build the building, have operational cash. So their list of people that they could talk to got really short really quick because it's only people with that kind of capital. What Truett decided, very different. He looked at the same thing, but his perspective was very different. He said, capital is the easy part, relatively speaking. Banks have stacks of it. You know, it's not that hard to find capital. He said, what's hard to find is talent. So he said, I'm going to find talent instead of capital. So the whole operator model that he created was that the talent was the central organizing idea, not the capital. And therefore, he said, you know what? I'm going to provide the capital in exchange for the talent, someone who would love to own their own business but doesn't have the capital. And like their dream would be, I'd love to have a family business. And man, if you could just provide me that platform. And so what he did is he set up the operator model, which basically means the operator would put, at that time, $5,000 security deposit down. And then he would become the owner operator of an individual restaurant location. And that operator would get 50% of the profit of that location every month. So they would be treated like an owner. We'd call them the owner. They'd be treated like an owner. They'd be rewarded like an owner. And we just split the profits every month, but they didn't have to put $3 or $4 million of capital up front. So we had, and Truett used to say, a restaurant always works better when the owner's on site. But here's the thing. Again, short-term consequence. All these other chains were growing a lot faster because if you can get people in with a lot of money, just like that Boston Market, you can grow
growth
a lot faster. So Truett had to grow slower, but it was really substantive growth. And it was growth based on the culture and the people and the leadership, and it was built to last. And so here we are today, you know, years later. Chick-fil-A is one of the biggest chains in the country, and, you know, now, you know, starting to expand the rest of the world. But it's built around the people, not the access to money and the talent and the culture. And therefore, you know, Chick-fil-A's restaurant location on average are about 10x the norm in the industry, and about 2 or 3 times McDonald's. All these that got off to a faster start, now Chick-fil-A in the long run, the overnight success story, 40 years in the making, has, you know, surpassed them, but it didn't happen in the short run. But it was another long-term decision, long-term perspective.
And the perspective, I've heard you say this, attributed to Truett, that, what is it? Businesses don't succeed or fail. People do. Yeah. And it's just a shift in perspective that leads to entirely different results from everybody else.
Yes.
And a willingness to not look around and say, what are other people doing? How do I imitate that? And maybe try to do it slightly better or work slightly harder at it, but to think it through an entirely different perspective.
And, you know, and sacrifice, like in the short run, all these other chains seemed like they were getting ahead of us, but in the long run, we got better.
Slow and steady wins the race.
Yeah.
When as Chick-fil-A started to hit that, you know, the $2,000 billion mark, there started to be that hockey stick moment.
Yes.
Would love, like, what was true of that inflection point in Chick-fil-A's history? Like, what was the mission, the mindset, the rallying point organizationally that allowed the trajectory altering shift to take place?
Well, I feel like there was definitely a hockey stick moment. And it was when we set a new mission. You know, if you're a people-centered business, the mission's super important. But our historic missions had been traditional missions. You know, been the academically correct mission. It's, you know, all around the number, and, you know, it's all numerically based and time constrained and all that. But
Smart goals.
Yeah, SMART goal, all these things that everyone, but then one year we decided to do a mission that was much more motivational, in my mind, much more people focused. And our mission one year became be remarkable.
2 words.
Two
be
words.
remarkable.
That was the mission. And so for academics, they would say, oh, you know, like if I had turned that business mission into one of my business school professors, probably would have tattooed an F on my forehead and said, this guy's a loser.
This isn't
That's
measurable.
terrible. It's not measurable.
It's not time bound.
Yeah, it doesn't fit any of the traditional mold. But for my money, and I think for Chick-fil-A, it became the most inspirational, motivational mission during my career. And it was the hockey stick moment. All of a sudden, after we set that mission, everything, sales, profits, you know, just a hockey stick moment on the numbers. But I got to go back to, what did be remarkable mean? Because perspective is so important. For us, it didn't mean stand on a stage, stretch out our hands, say, look how remarkable we are, beat our chest. It wasn't that. It was, at the end of the day, we want to mark the lives of the people we serve. Kind of 3 things. Mark the lives of the people we serve. Second, all of us wanted to look back on a career worth remarking about. And finally, on a daily basis, we wanted to do things that customers would remark about, because it's always been true that word of mouth advertising is the most important and the most effective and the strongest form of advertising. But it's exponentially more true today than it's ever been throughout human history. Why?
Because the megaphone of social media.
Yeah, social media gives
the
everybody a
amplification.
megaphone. You got all these individual, you know, TV stations, people broadcasting to their network. And that's never been true before, but it's really true now. So if we could get customers to remark about what we're doing, if we could be so good that they'd want to remark about then all of a sudden things would really take off. And your customers then became an unpaid sales force out there, you know, raving about you and bringing new people into the system because of the great job you'd done for them. So the whole be remarkable idea really turned things around. Because again, who was that focused on? It wasn't focused on shareholders. It wasn't focused on the accounting people. It was focused on, are we going to do something that customers find worthy of remarking about? And are we going to have a career worth remarking about? And I'm sorry, just selling chicken sandwich, fries, and drinks, for me, would not have been a career worth remarking about. It had to be more powerful than that.
More purposeful.
More purposeful than that.
Yes.
And so it got us focused on things more powerful, more purposeful, more energizing than just numbers on a spreadsheet.
I hear that. And there's a profound sense of, like, it was not just a message, it was an identity.
Yes.
And there's a
That's
sense of
a great way to
identity
think about
that
it.
cloaked the entire organization.
Yes.
That people could live into. And the beauty of it's specific, but it's also broad enough for people to come to the table with their unique skill sets and giftings and find their way to contribute to the remarkability of Chick-fil-A. And, you know, it seems like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it wasn't, hey, let's create remarkable advertising out of the gate where it's just like messaging and shock value.
No, because we want to be remarkable.
We want to be, and
so it is an identity. I'd never thought about it that way. That's a really good insight. It was an identity that we gave everyone to live into and live up to.
Yes. And I'm wondering, the timeline might not work, but you think about that identity trickling down to the front line, and there is a sense of how do we create a remarkable employee experience that leads to a remarkable customer experience, and then things like my pleasure start to make sense. Things like a team member walking the order out to a car for somebody who's, you know, toting 3 kids behind them starts to make sense.
Yes.
Start to, like, how did that trickle down
Yes.
from just like be remarkable to creating remarkable experiences?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of people now associate the 2 words "my pleasure" with Chick-fil-A, but actually, we learned that from Ritz-Carlton.
It's so good.
That was something we creatively borrowed. I don't like to say steal because we don't steal, but we creatively borrowed it.
With credit, obviously.
With credit from Ritz-Carlton. But a lot of people now say, you know, what genius that was. Well, we just borrowed it from a real genius in Horst Schulze and the Ritz-Carlton. But here's what's fascinating about it. It's really not about the 2 words, "my pleasure." because people could imitate those two words. It really became an identity that it truly is my pleasure. It was about the spirit of, it is my pleasure to serve people. And we would hire to that. We would train to that. We would reward to that. It's like it became an identity as well, that it's my pleasure to serve you. And it's not that we're servants to people. You know, that's one of the things I loved about Ritz Carlton. They said, we are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen.
So good.
You
And
know,
that's an identity as well.
yeah, it's an identity as well. But I do feel like, you know, that our whole second mile service in it is kind of interesting. Maybe we should talk about that a little bit, because that
I would
really
love
is
to hear. Yes.
related to this. So, interestingly, there was a time in 2007 and 8 where there was a financial crisis in this country. And for those that are a little younger, it would be just like what we just went through with COVID, you know, where every business was cutting back on expenses and laying people off. And it was the 2007-8 financial crisis. So Chick-fil-A was trying to weather that as well. But it was interesting because Truett and Dan had an idea that instead of cutting back, which is what almost everybody around us was doing, laying people off, they said, this is our chance to take a giant leap forward.
Long-term mindset,
view,
contrarian.
it's like while everyone else
Zig and
cut
zag.
back. So it's funny. They wanted to do a multi-million-dollar service initiative that later became known as Second Mile Service. Well, it was born during a time, financial crisis, when everybody's cutting back. We said, well, if everybody's going to cut back, it's the perfect time for us to leap forward. So we did a multi-million-dollar, and I remember being in the budget discussions, Aaron. Other than Truett and Dan, no one was really excited about it.
Nobody's raising their hand.
No one's
saying,
raising their hand, because it's like, we got to preserve
Yes.
all the capital we have. What are we thinking? What are we doing? But fortunately, in a privately held business, Truett and Dan can make that decision. But here's the thing I loved about Chick-fil-A. Even though a lot of people were kind of against it because they didn't see the merit to it. And it's interesting, too, because the arguments were strong, as they typically are. The argument would be, if someone wants service, they don't come to a fast food restaurant. They go to a white tablecloth where they pay 3 times as much for the chicken and they tip for the service. And it's like, what do you know, if people want service, fast food by definition is not where they're coming. So why would we worry about service? They want food fast. And so it
broke the model.
It broke the model. But Dan and Truett were thinking long term, said, however, if they're not coming looking for service and you give it to them, that level of service, won't that create a lot of value? And so we spent multi-million dollars creating the Second Mile Service Initiative. We then spent multi-million dollars bringing people to Atlanta to train to the second and initiate that whole thing. Well, after that, all of a sudden, prior to that, almost all the things I would hear people talk about at Chick-fil-A were the food. And there was that old adage, it's the economy, stupid.
Yep.
Well, at Chick-fil-A, the going adage would have been, it's the food, stupid. Why should we care about service or even marketing? It's all about the food.
So even within Chick-fil-A, it wasn't
Chick-fil-A.
like everybody was 100% aligned.
No, because it's like, it's the food, stupid.
Yes.
They're coming to pay for the food. Food fast.
Yes.
So let's do that. Well, it turns out it was kind of a genius move from Dan and Truett, because all of a sudden now, Chick-fil-A over the next 8 or 10 years, I would argue that Chick-fil-A today is more known for service than food.
100%.
And it was this whole new layer of value that was created for customers. I go to Chick-fil-A now more often because I know the bathrooms are going to be clean, because I know if they have 50 people in the drive-thru, I'll get through faster than the one next door with 5. And you know, it's the service is just run rings around now. The product is still as good. It's the same product, but you add that new level of service that you would. And the reason we called it Second Mile Service is interesting, because there was a level of service that we had already, and I would call it the First Mile Service.
Yep. Expectation.
And that's the way I would define the first mile, is about meeting expectations. But the second mile is about things people wouldn't expect. How do we create value by giving them what they wouldn't expect from a fast food restaurant versus what they would? And so the first mile is all about doing things with excellence, everything they expect with excellence, first mile. Second mile is doing things they would never expect with excellence from a fast food restaurant.
It's so good. The willingness to take a different perspective. There's a guy named Rory Sutherland.
Yeah.
Advertising executive. He wrote a book called Alchemy.
Yeah.
It's a great read.
Yeah.
And he has a funny line.
We used to use that, actually. Not that book,
yes,
but that idea.
Yep.
How do you turn lead into gold?
Yes. And he has a funny line where he talks about logic wins in air traffic control and medicine, and logic gets you killed in war and business.
Interesting.
And I think about the principle here of everybody, economic recession, we pull back, we get tight, pull our belt tighter. It was, no, we're going to go and make even bigger investments in those moments as everybody shrinks. A consistent pattern of how do we defy logic, and maybe even logic that people inside the four walls of Chick-fil-A felt, but make investments that yield a longer term result.
You know, that reminds me of another little dimension to second mile service. What was fascinating, we defined second mile service as providing service people wouldn't expect from a fast food restaurant. So for a guy like me, I like creative, innovative. I like creating new things. So this was like, you know, nirvana for me.
Going. Yep.
But here's the funny thing about it, and the thing we got to point out. So we would start doing things we'd never done before, creating things that people had never seen before. But then all of a sudden we keep doing them. So over time, what happens? It becomes what they expect.
Yeah.
And so now all that work we put into creating something they wouldn't expect now moves to the first mile. And so it's like, bummer. You know, it's like blessing when we came up with it. And now it's like, bummer. It's now first mile. It's what they expect. So now we got, but here's the thing I didn't realize. The minute they expect it from us, who else do they expect it from?
Everybody else.
Everybody else. So what we're really doing is raising the bar for the whole industry. And we could keep coming up with new ideas that they weren't doing, but we had to realize we'll come up with a new idea, but it's only novel for a season, and then it moves to expectations. But it's this ongoing cycle, but actually it's a blessing. So it's kind of like blessing, it works.
It's opportunity.
Curse, now it's expected, but blessing because now it's become an expectation, and it gives us the opportunity to come up with new things that we hadn't done before. So it's a never-ending cycle of coming up with second mile ideas that then become first mile, but you now become the leader in the industry. Dan Cathy used to say, the thought leader becomes the market leader. You don't have to have the most cash.
The other. Yeah.
The thought leader becomes the market leader.
It's the Jeff Bezos quote, customers are divinely discontent.
Yes.
And it's the idea of yesterday's delight is today's satisfied, is tomorrow's disappointment. I think we've talked about this. Brian Chesky, who is one of my all-time favorite business heroes. If you ever run across him, you have to connect me. He's amazing. He had an insight where he would say at Airbnb, a guest rates an experience on a 5-star scale. We've talked about this. 1 star means that everything goes wrong. 3 star means that one big thing goes wrong. 5 star means that nothing goes wrong. You met expectations. And his insight to his team was that we need to be a brand that's about exceeding expectations, not just meeting expectations.
Yes.
I won't go into the whole thing, but he talked about what is a 6-star, 7-star, 8-star. What does a 10-star experience look like for Airbnb? And there's this beautiful space.
When you told me that story, I was thinking second mile service versus first mile.
It is Airbnb's model of second mile service. And there's a space that most brands don't push past. It's, before impossible, but past what was previously thought possible. That I think remarkable experience is.
Yes.
It's the space that you live in. And that's where you get the second mile service.
I'll tell you another thing I learned through that season of the gift of poverty at Chick-fil-A that's related to everything we're talking about. So when I first started with Chick-fil-A, if we were listing, the fast food chains, we were probably number 100 down the list, or 150 or whatever, 200. We were way down the list. And so we used to have little pity parties in that mobile home. And it'd be, oh, woe is me. If only we had the resources of McDonald's and, Burger
a bigger
King.
brand, established brand.
If we just had their kind of budgets and their kind of staff, man, what couldn't we do? But I learned along the way that business is less about how much green matter you have and more about how much gray matter you have and more about how much red matter. And gray matter, just being inventive, being creative, thinking, being the thought leader. Red matter is the passion you have. Gray matter, red matter, trump green matter all day long. And so what we lacked in this, we had to make up for in this.
Double
and this.
down here
But
and
this
here.
is, and I remember there was a guy named Ross Perot years ago that ran for president. And, billionaire, Texas oil man, billionaire. But he said something during his campaign that really caught my attention and was motivational to me at that time, because we didn't have a lot of green matter to throw at things. So we didn't have like a choice, but it forced us to really develop our gray matter and a red matter. But he said this, the more money I have, the stupider I get. And at first I
Preach.
didn't get it. I know you're smart.
I've heard
You got
the story.
it
Yeah.
immediately. But for me, it's like, what does he mean by? Well, basically, what he was saying is, the more green matter I have, the more I substitute green matter for gray matter, red matter. The more I just throw a lot of money at things to try and solve all my problems. And generally speaking, that's going to be the least efficient, the least effective way. And so the more constrained we are with green matter, the more it forces us to use the more effective tools, which are gray matter, red matter. So I think the problem for a bigger business, like in the early days, we had no choice. We didn't have this to go to. But as Chick-fil-A's gotten bigger, I think the struggle for every big corporation, now you have plenty of this. But do you start to rely on this, and then other people come in and they're using more gray matter, more red matter, and they start to run rings around you? And so I think you've got to really be careful. If you're like a small startup, then this is great news for you. If you're a big company, then you got to avoid going the easy route to just try and throw money at everything to solve all your problems, because it's never going to be the most effective, efficient, smartest. Thought leaders become market leaders.
I love one of the ways that in the earlier days that you used, I think, gray matter, and not building on the idea of thought leader becomes market leader.
Yes.
Was you didn't just think about what does remarkable experiences look like for Chick-fil-A. You said, what does remarkable experience look like globally, period. And you had a team that went out and experienced the most remarkable experiences far beyond the QSR or food service industry. Tell me about what was the genesis of saying hey, as we think about the urgency of day to day and all the priorities that we have, I'm going to have my team go out and gain all of these remarkable experiences that I think in the long run will make us better.
Yes. Well, subsequent to us declaring "Be Remarkable" as our mission statement, we started to kind of reframe a lot of what we did. And we were creating experiences not only in restaurants, because that was super important, but we also, about that time, were a sponsor of college athletics. We had become the title sponsor of the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl. What was the Peach Bowl, then became the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl, then it became the Chick-fil-A Bowl, and that kind of thing. And so we're very fascinated by creating remarkable experiences. And one of the things that we were convinced of is, if you want to become excellent, you got to study excellence. And generally speaking, excellence was not found in the industry that we were in. To study excellence, we had to look way beyond the fast food business, generally speaking, because there wasn't a lot of excellence. So we would look to wherever excellence was. And this is one of the things Chick-fil-A is really good about, is that they would enable people like me and all of my peers to go out and study excellence wherever we could find it. So you cannot almost name a company we didn't go study. The Apples of the world, the Googles. Here we are, fast food companies. Well, why would you study Apple? Because that's where excellence is. And then we would find, and I'm kind of an experiential learner, so I'd have to go see it. And then we could translate it back. What would that look like at Chick-fil-A? So we specifically put a team together and said, we're going to go study the most remarkable experiences in the world that we can find, and then create a set of principles that seem to be, what are the principles underlying all these remarkable experiences? And we ended up creating a series of principles, and then we would apply those to all the experiences we were trying to create. And we literally created kind of a proprietary set of principles, and then we had a sheet that we would go through, and we would take any experience we were going to create and take it through those and say, okay, we're really good on this principle, but we really need to work on that. We don't have any of this.
Yes.
You can think of as ingredients in a recipe or whatever.
You can mix together.
We got salt and sugar, but we don't have any vanilla or whatever. And so every experience could be mapped back to these principles, and it would enable us to take each of these things to the next level. And it was fascinating studying all those. We went to see a delivery of a BMW, went to China, had what used to be called the World's Fair is now called the World Expo. We went to China to study that. And then we go to simple things here in the United States. We go to we were in the college football space. We'd go visit every year the college football national championship to say, what does that experience look like and what is ours missing? Because arguably when we originally sponsored what was then the Peach Bowl, if you were listing bowls, they probably would have been number 27 or 28 down the list. And now they're arguably one of the top 4 or 5 bowls. Well, that didn't happen overnight. Again, but we said we had to study, what does it look like to be one of the best 4 or 5 bowls? What's missing? And then every year we'd kind of, over time, we'd get better and better and better over time. And now, arguably, I think the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl would be, it is one of the top 6 bowls in the country by definition. And But it didn't start that way, and we migrated that way. But we studied excellence where we could find it. We distilled the principles, and then we apply those principles to what we're doing to kind of chip away at making it better.
And I believe there are 8 principles, and
Yeah.
we can do a whole nother conversation going through the 8. But like to your point, there are ingredients that create structure, but
Yes.
also there's the freedom within. It's not a
And show you where gaps are.
yes.
It's almost a gap analysis.
Evaluate
Yeah.
gap analysis.
Yeah.
And give you. There's innovation and creativity and freedom within the 8 principles.
Yep.
While also giving a broader organization a formula by which to think about creating remarkable experiences.
Yes.
I think one of the things that is often like most remarkable, most visibly outside of the restaurant experience are the Chick-fil-A cows. Like that's taken on a life of its own. We need to talk about the cow story.
Okay. Well, it's interesting because the cow story almost takes a lot of what we've been talking about and puts it all in one little story. So about the mid-90s, we were starting to realize that our future was going to be the very first Chick-fil-A freestanding location opened in 1986.
Okay. 86.
There was only one freestander.
So
in
all
the whole
malls,
chain.
one.
All malls, one freestander. And then once we opened the first freestander, we started opening a few more. And so by the early 90s, we were starting to say the future may look more like freestanders than malls. Therefore, our marketing had to change. And in malls, we used to say we are captive audience marketers because we weren't trying to get people to come to the mall. Once they're there,
Yeah.
we have a captive audience. How do we get them to eat with us once they're at the mall?
Yeah.
But with freestanders, we said we need to become destination marketers. We literally need to get people to get up out of their office and drive to it, or off their sofa or whatever, and come. So we had to market differently for a freestander, and we realized that. So we started to change the way we're marketing, and therefore we created a project we called Project 1999. That's
Okay.
what we started in the early 90s, and we said, let's accelerate in just a couple of markets what we need to look like by 1999 when freestanders are the predominant part of our footprint.
So again, long-term
So
thinking.
long-term thinking. We said this is 1999, but let's artificially accelerate that process in just a couple of markets. Not everywhere, just a couple of markets. So we hired a new ad agency, and that was really the key to the whole thing. Is here another study excellence. We were very much rookies at hiring an agency. So we started saying, who in our sphere of influence is really good at this? And fortunately for us, we're located here in Atlanta, Georgia. There's a little company called Coca-Cola that we sell Coca-Cola products.
Might have
We
heard
said-
of them.
Yeah. We said, they're pretty good at this advertising stuff. So we literally went and got tutored by their chief marketing officer. And he sat down with us and shared with us how they would evaluate agencies. And they had it down to a science. And so instead of us trying to make all the rookie mistakes, they said, let's just go learn from somebody who's really good at it. And another thing is they say the beginning of wisdom is humility.
That's so good.
And we wanted to be wise about this. So we were humble enough to say, we don't know it all. Let's go study people who do. And fortunately, because we sold Coke products, they were happy to help us with it. And over the years, we got more from Coke by just learning from them than we got through the syrup, in a lot of ways. And so, but this is a very specific example. So they shared with us their whole process. They even gave us a list of 120 agencies that they thought were the very best that we should consider. So we started with their list of 120 agencies, but they also said this. They said, you got a problem. I said, well, what's that? I said, well, once an agency signs up with one fast food chain, it kind of blocks them out from doing business with anybody
Competitive
else.
reasons.
Competitive reason. You can't work for two fast food chains. So a lot of the best agencies already had fast food
Off the table.
clients. And we, at that time, again, on a list of the top 100 fast food, we were probably number 80 or 90. So we weren't a very attractive client. The gift of poverty. We didn't have a lot of this to throw at them. So we just recognized that. We said, okay, well, let's factor that into our thinking. So we took the list of 120, got it down to about 20 that didn't have conflicts at the moment. We personally went and visited all 20 agencies. Myself and another gentleman went and visited all 20 of them. And because we knew if we wanted to have a relationship for the long term, that culture was going to be part of this. And there were things beyond their work that were going to be part of it. So
You needed a true partner.
we need a true partner. And so we went around and got the 20 down to about 3. Now, here's where we were very counterintuitive with our thinking. We knew we didn't have a lot of this to throw at them. So the standard way that marketing works is the agency would have to spend a ton of money to pitch your business. And at that time, on average, it might have been $100,000 something they would spend in creating all this stuff, doing all this research to pitch your business. And they're out.
With no guarantee.
With no guarantee of getting the business. So we said, knowing that we don't have a lot of money to throw at them, let's not get them to throw a lot of money at us. Let's do something different. So I sat down. I'll never forget Stan Richards at the Richards Group was the agency and I sat down with Stan. He was a privately held business, and sat down with Stan and said, Stan, we may never be your biggest customer. We probably will never write you the biggest checks, but we want to be your best client. What does it look like to be your best client? And I could see his eyes lit up at this point because I knew he's
had never been asked that question.
Never been asked that question. And I knew he was motivated by things beyond just money. Creative people like to do creative work. They like to be put in a position to do their very best work. And most clients, because they're throwing a lot of money, it becomes like a slave, to the person throwing the money. And they treat them like that. It's like, we're going to throw a lot of money at you, and so now you're going to be slave.
We demand these things of you.
We're just the opposite. We said, so we want to partner with you and enable you to do your best work. And I said, what would it look like? And so he started talking. I started taking notes. I said, okay, this is how we're going to get an in with agency that shouldn't be doing business with us. Here's the other thing we did. Very counterintuitive. We said, Stan, instead of you spend a lot of money to pitch us, we're going to pay you to do a project for us. Now, it wasn't a lot. It was a modest amount of money.
But so unexpected.
But it was so unexpected because now instead of them having to spend money, we're going to pay them money to do a project with us. But here was our motivation. We said all these agencies are really good. All 3 agencies they're all really good. We wanted to see what would it be like to work with them. So we gave them each 30 days. We gave them each the exact same assignment. And we paid them each the exact same amount of money. And we came with open hands and we said, we're happy to help in any way. We'll share with you, because that's another thing that people do with agencies is they say, we're going to pay you a bunch of money. Therefore, you have to come. You have to be super genius. We're not going to tell you a thing.
You have to read our minds.
You got to read our minds, and you got to come present this, and show us what geniuses you are. And it makes it really hard on them because they don't know your business as well as you do. And ultimately, it needs to be a partnership anyway. Yes. So our thinking behind is we're going to pay them, because that'll get their interest, and we're going to be totally open-handed, but let's see how they approach it. And all 3 took a very different approach. The Richards Group was like all over it. They were like, they wanted information. They wanted to bring us into the process. The other 2, not so much. It's like, we're just going to come back and impress you with what. So ultimately, we ended up picking the Richards Group. But here's the other thing that we did is, again, counterintuitively. You would think ad businesses, what ad agencies love to show you is their TV work. Because they love doing the TV work. And
the sexy work.
The sexy work. It is the sexy work. But we realized we're a little Chick-fil-A. We don't have enough money to out-advertise, TV advertise McDonald's and Burger King. And so right up front, we decided, what's a medium that no one else is using? Like, where could we dominate?
Yeah.
And where would it be scalable for us to dominate?
Yes.
And we decided, we kind of inspired by what we'd seen in LA and Orlando with 3D billboards. Those were the only 2 cities we could find much in 3D. But the 3D billboards really stood out because they were 3D and they were building a brand. Most people were using billboards at the time as what we call directional. Next exit, turn right.
Yep.
So the assignment we gave them was, we want to do 3D billboards because we can dominate that and it's easily scalable.
Yeah.
Like, we're only going to be doing this in 3 markets. So if we did a national TV ad or whatever, it goes to all these places that we don't do business or didn't need it. So it allowed us to localize it. It allowed us to put together a medium that was scalable and that we could grow over time. So it said 3D billboards. We wanted to see their TV because we knew eventually that might be part of it. But really what we're focused on was 3D billboards. And so we ended up giving the Richards Group, could tell you a lot more about that, but we gave the Richards Group the business, and we started with billboards. And so I brought some of the billboards that they created.
This is I'm so excited for this.
One of the first billboards they created was this.
And this is the original.
This was...
you received this from the Richards Group.
Richards Group kind of pitched this, and it's, don't have a cow. Now, in this case, this was actually one from later on. We didn't have directions initially, but it was just don't have a cow. And we loved this because it was a very popular line.
Yes.
And at that time, our main competition was not other chicken sandwiches. It was burgers. We were competing with the burger chains because almost no one else had a chicken sandwich.
You have the chicken sandwich in the background, don't have a cow.
And so we loved it, and we used it, but we said, but we need a 3D version of this. And they said, well, we're not sure it's a 3D idea. And so, but we kept going back to this idea. We said it's very powerful, and they created lots of other billboards for us. So the next one they created that was a lot of fun was this one. It was a giant rubber chicken, and it says, if it's not Chick-fil-A, it's a joke.
Oh my.
So
I mean, that's a massive billboard.
This was a massive billboard. That was like a 48-foot rubber chicken.
So it's a 48-foot rubber chicken.
And it was out in Dallas, Texas, which is where the Richards Group
gosh.
was. Well, here's what was interesting about this one. When we first put it up, we just put the chicken up for a month. Nothing else.
Okay, so
there was
no
line,
Chick-fil-A logo.
No, and we're just trying to generate some interest.
Oh, this is so good.
And then later we added this, so it kind of solved the mystery. Everybody's one. But here's what was funny is this became an iconic billboard in Dallas to the point that, you know how they have the traffic helicopters and they say, you know, well, this was on a major toll road in Dallas, right at the toll booth. And so every day the helicopter was, we're at the rubber chicken, you know, and so it became like a you know, just iconic in the city of Dallas. And so we love this idea. So
we moved from the rubber chicken to
from the rubber chicken to the next one was this one, where there was a billboard, the original chicken sandwich, and then the painter apparently got hungry because he saw how good the chicken sandwich was, and his boss got hungry. Back soon, like he was taking a break. So this one was 3D. It had a 3D ladder, buckets, all that kind of stuff. And so one day after all three of these, in fact, they were taking down one of them, or one of the creatives came up, tapped me on the shoulder at the and said, you know that don't have a cow? I think we've got an idea for you. And what had happened is the don't have a cow and the rubber chicken and this one had all melded in his mind. And literally, I'm going to show you the actual board they presented us that day.
Oh, this is so good.
This was the very original board they presented. They said, basically, Eat More Chicken came from Don't Have a Cow. The cow, the 3D cows, were the rubber chickens in his mind. And then they had the paint and the ladder is what they eventually had, became from that. So all three of those billboards kind of came together in the mind of this creative. And this was the board they presented. And what's fascinating about this board is when we actually went to produce it, they realized that it was just a little too long. So they took this C out of it. And the actual board now is CHIKIN. And so that's how you always
because
know
it was
the
too
original
long.
board is just a little too long. And just graphically, it didn't look right to them and played better. And so, but the original Chick-fil-A billboard was actually just a combination. Now, here's the other thing that was fascinating about this. When they presented this idea, they said, we want to present an idea, but it's off strategy. Because the strategy we had at the time was we didn't invent the chicken, just the chicken sandwich. So everything else we've been doing
that was the platform.
That was the platform, that was the line, and this didn't fit that. But all of us fell in love with it. We said, we got to try it. And fortunately for us, this was 1994 or 5 when they created it. Well, the Olympics were coming to Atlanta. And there was a gold rush for billboards in Atlanta because everybody wanted a billboard because the whole world is coming to Atlanta. So it's like the perfect time to have presence in Atlanta. Well, we had gotten some billboards because we knew that we wanted to do 3D billboards. So we had locked one down for years between the Atlanta airport and downtown Atlanta. And we decided to put this billboard up during the Olympics in Atlanta. The next year, at the end of 96, we did a survey of our brand awareness and advertising awareness. We had one billboard in the entire city, and we had all these other billboards we'd done throughout this one eclipsed the recognition, the memory. Everybody remembered this one, not so much all the others. And so we said, we really got something here. And so then the challenge became, how do we take it from a billboard, which could have been a one-off? It could have been, well, that was a great billboard. Now let's move on. I think the real genius actually came in how do we translate this into a campaign that could last for years and go into the stores and all that kind of stuff. And so there's a whole nother story about how we translate this into a campaign that lasts to this day.
One of the most iconic campaigns.
Yeah, and
longest
it's won
enduring.
international awards. It's won all kind of things. And here's the other thing. At my retirement party, Stan came up to me. He said, David, I remember our first conversation. You told me you may never be our biggest client. You just want to be the best. He said, well, first of all, you were our best client. But secondly, you need to realize we grew from a $200 million ad agency to a $1 billion agency. And he said, it's almost all as a result of this campaign. He said, because whenever we would take on a new client, they'd all say, create a cow campaign for us.
I want
he said,
that.
almost every client they got after this was as a result of this. So he said, you didn't ever rise to the biggest checks, but you had the biggest impact on our business. So again, it's very counterintuitive. It's because we started with a lack of this. And we were constrained by this. And it made us approach it in a healthier, more sustainable way. And it's really a cultural issue. Again, it's like we paid them to do the thing, to do the project initially, and we said, let's create the environment you can do your best work and do award-winning work, and that'll be important to your business. And so it's leveraging all of what apparently look like our weaknesses into strengths.
Turning them in, and the humility to call them into true partnership.
Yes.
Because it's easy once you have the strategy to shut down anything that's off strategy.
Yes.
And
the other thing is there was a original president of Chick-fil-A, a guy named Jimmy Collins, not Jim Collins, the author, but a guy named Jimmy Collins. He retired at the end of 2000 after we became $1 billion business, 2001. And he said something interesting in his farewell speech that I've never forgotten. He said, I want to remind you guys at Chick-fil-A, he said, it's easier to become a success than to stay one. And he said, I'm not saying it was easy to become a success, $1 billion business. He said, I'm just saying it's easier, relatively speaking, than staying one. And I didn't really get it at the time. I think he was just much wiser. He had more. But I think what he was saying is, once you become a success, you got a lot of this, and it's easy to fall back on, just preserving what you've got instead of maintaining your thought. And it's really hard if you do have a lot of this to constrain yourself from using it and to go more to gray matter, red matter. He said that's really hard to do, and I've seen what he means. It is very hard once you do have a lot of this. So for your listeners, those who don't have much of this, congratulations. Yeah. What an advantage you have. And for those who do, beware, because it can make you lazy.
Yep. David, this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you for bringing this and sharing this. Admire you a whole lot as both a leader and a friend, and just thankful for your friendship.
My pleasure.
Man, here we go. This is so fun. Thank you, David.
Yes, sir.